Good morning, Rob. This is Rob Cooney coming at you from over at FlipDM, and I wanted to put together a special screencast, combine our sites, so to speak. And I wanted to talk to you today about an educational topic that I like learning about, and that is the neurobiology of learning. I will give you a link to the article that I'm using as the main content for this one, and you can download that, read it yourself, and share your thoughts once you've done that. But essentially, there are a bunch of tenets of neurobiology that we can actually use to improve our teaching. And these are fairly well recognized in the neurobiology literature. And so I wanted to go through them one at a time and talk to you about those by themselves. So the first tenet is repetition. And we know this to be a important topic. You know, how many times do we have to practice our suturing knots? How many times do we have to look through a particular content area in order to get it down? But one of the problems within medical education is that our curriculum is so bloated that it doesn't really allow repetition in any logical fashion. You know, those first 2 years of medical school we fondly referred to as academic bulimia, you know, the binge and purge of learning. And the point of medical education at times seems to be to avoid those redundancies in order to effectively manage time. But what that doesn't allow is it doesn't allow learners to take that deep dive into the literature. And we know that when you actually do a deeper dive and you allow that repetition, the learners will have better retention and they'll have a better depth of understanding. The question is, you know, how do we do the spacing on this? And that's a thing that I think this just-in-time training is starting to address. And you know, the spaced repetition type of literature is also starting to address, and we need to be paying attention to that. The next tenet is reward, and how reward is reinforcement. You know, the two of these play off of each other. And there's a lot of areas that we can use these within medical education. You know, the gamification theory with the use of badges is one of those things that we're starting to look into. And one of the other things that I always like is what I call the law of the scoreboard. And I'm stealing this directly from leadership expert John Maxwell, where he talks about, you know, why do you have scoreboards at a game? It's so that each team knows who's winning and who's losing. And you don't know what your progress is without being able to see it. And so, how often do we actually put our learners' progress on a scoreboard for them to see? And this is one of those things where we're starting to see, you know, dashboards in just medicine in general, where we see how we're doing in terms of our quality metrics and things like that. But how many of us actually think about doing dashboards with things like the milestones to allow a learner to see where they're ranking in their milestone acquisition? The other thing we need to remember with rewards and reinforcement is that, you know, the human brain really likes those immediate rewards much more so than the distant rewards, and those immediate rewards kind of trump those distant rewards unless there's a coping mechanism that's been applied, such as those kids in the famous marshmallow experiment where they do distraction techniques to prevent themselves from eating the marshmallow so they can have two in 15 minutes. But distant rewards in terms of medical education are things like board passage and the acquisition of a medical degree, whereas the immediate reward can be the understanding. And so if we can promote that understanding in our learners, that again will reinforce their learning and will serve as its own reward. One of the next cool topics is visualization, and we've heard a lot about this in medical education recently. And visualization is kind of that mental rehearsal, and it's used all the time in athletics, but it really, I think, is kind of underused within medical education working with our residents. So how many of us, before going into an intubation, will sit down with our learners and kind of say, okay, close your eyes, talk me through the process that you're seeing. And, you know, that that visualization and that mental rehearsal then affect their kinesthetic response when they're actually in the room. And one of the other ways that visualization works is with mirror neurons. So if you see somebody else do something, you in turn can, you know, visualize that in your brain and start to build those kinesthetic pathways without ever having touched the material to begin with. Now, one of the caveats here is the skill of the learner really matters when it comes to visualization. And so this may not be for a novice who is new to the material, but is more for the experienced learners who have some degree of motor skill already that they can build upon. Next up, active engagement. This is one of those things that I've been harping on for years with the flipped curriculum that we've been using. And we see this all the time within our learners. Functional changes in learning occur best when that learner is engaged. And so what do? We throw them right in front of a lecture, which is one of the most passive methods of learning. So we're starting to see the lecture go away a little bit. We're seeing more small group learning. We're seeing more problem-based and team-based learning and small group interaction. Now, that being said, there are ways to increase active engagement within a lecture, so the appropriate use of questioning, allowing the student to come up and be a teacher for a part of it, or putting out questions that the learners then have to go and find information, and allowing them that time to find the information can also increase their active engagement. And this active engagement actually plays into the very next topic, which is stress. Now, stress is a bad thing, right? Well, not always. We've known for a while that there's an optimal curve of learning where at the right amount of stress, the learning is optimal. Too much stress, and you lead to anxiety, and too little stress, and you lead to boredom. And so what we need to do is kind of focus on getting our learners into this zone right here of optimal stress. And the nice thing is that active engagement can increase the stress levels, but it's kind of that Goldilocks phenomenon. You don't want too much stress, you don't want too little, and you have to be really careful because some learners are going to be more sensitive than others, and you don't want to overstimulate those particular learners when you're applying stress. Now, how about some negative things from neurobiology? What about fatigue? Well, we've long known that fatigue is bad. Unfortunately, we don't really understand how to mitigate fatigue quite as well as we should. Even with the duty hours restrictions, it doesn't seem like medical residents are sleeping any more than before. And sleep is really important to learning because it's that downtime that allows the brain to replay the day's activity and cement that knowledge into the long-term memory. One of the other ways that we need to pay attention to fatigue is after intense activities. So if your learner was just involved with a code, you probably want to give them a little bit of downtime before you thrust them back into the clinical work, just so that they can kind of recharge their batteries, even for a few minutes, not necessarily go give them a nap, but give them a little bit of a chance to rest, recover, and be ready to face the next task. Otherwise, their stress level is going to go into that anxiety realm, and then they won't be able to adequately learn. One of the other negative things is multitasking. It's becoming more and more recognized lately that multitasking is a bad thing within learning. It increases cognitive load, which therefore decreases the amount of learning that people are able to retain. So how can we kind of guide this multitasking a little bit? Well, when you've got experienced learners who are already familiar with the material, maybe you want to have them run your emergency medicine residency Twitter feed. So that way they're kind of focusing on what's being said and putting it into note form, and it kind of gives them that multitasking feeling without really distracting from lecture. One of the other things is if you know that your residents are on Twitter and kind of going to that in the middle of a lecture, you can do auto tweets, such as John Greenwood illustrated in a previous post on this blog. Other things that you can do as well is you can record the lectures so that learners can watch them on their own time, and you can actually send out follow-up information after the lecture so that you again hit them with that repetition thing and take advantage of their tendency to believe that they're very good multitaskers. What about learning styles? Well, contrary to Chris's post, learning styles are a real thing, and I intend to do a full follow-up post on learning styles. I do agree with this post that the visual, auditory, kinesthetic learner type of concept is probably garbage, and what we're referring to here in learning styles is just that, people's personality affects how they learn. So some people tend to be more reflective than others. Others tend to be more active and involved. It's kind of that introvert extrovert learning style instead of just a listening, reading, and feeling type of learning. The best way to incorporate the learning styles is just to try and incorporate the right approaches. And again, this also links back to stress, in that if we're subjecting a learner to a type of learning style that is not in tune with their own way of learning, it increases their stress and can really push them outside of that optimal learning area and into the anxiety realm. Or again, if it's too in line with them, they may actually get bored with it. And K. Anders Ericsson, the father of deliberate practice, kind of talks about this when he describes the problem with flow, or that optimal state of performance, and how it detracts from learning, and that you really want just a bit of stress to be applied so that deliberate practice can then engage and learning can be improved. And then finally, the last thing is revisiting. And so revisiting is kind of, again, kind of ties into that repetition type of thing. It kind of ties into learning styles, but it's presenting the same information in via different pathways. So it's giving them reading versus video versus that kinesthetic. And by revisiting the material in multiple formats, that allows the learner to bring more neural hardware online in order to learn the material more appropriately. So go ahead, reflect on these pearls from the neurobiology, and think about how you can actually apply these to your own teaching in order to improve your learners' outcomes. This is Rob Cooney from the I Teach EM blog, signing off.